Hello, I'm Daniel Shatzkin, the editor-in-chief of Champion Briefs LD Products, and I'm thrilled to present our September-October 2024 video topic analysis. So let's get started. Anytime a topic on wages or workers' rights comes up, my brain immediately goes to Dolly Parton. Working 9 to 5, what a way to make a living, barely getting by, it's all taken and no giving. I'm a bad singer, so that's why I didn't sing it. But in that one line, she captures the feelings that any person who has worked a 9 to 5 job or really any job whatsoever has felt at some point. If you talk to anyone who works, there are going to be days that are good and days that are bad. And a lot of times it all comes down to the fact of how much money we are making to do a certain job. Many Americans today, especially in the middle and lower class, have seen their wages stagnated. Prices have gone up. The wealthiest Americans have seen their incomes rise exponentially, and the gap between the wealthy and the rest of us has grown wider. And there's also been a gap in the debate about how to close it that has grown equally as wide. The September-October 2024 resolution resolved the United States ought to require that workers receive a living wage presents us an opportunity to critically examine the issues behind wage inequality in this country. This resolution delves deep into questions about labor, capital, and the responsibilities of the state and businesses. It challenges our assumptions that not all jobs it challenges the assumptions, rather, that not all jobs should provide a decent standard of living. It confronts moralistic judgment that certain low-wage jobs are meant for teenagers or that workers just didn't try hard enough. These assumptions are very common in public discourse, and they reflect deeper philosophical themes that the living wage debate forces us to confront. So let us explore the case for and against the living wage through several lenses, such as justice, social responsibility, and utilitarianism. Before delving into arguments, we must define key terms in the resolution. Workers and living wage, to me, are the most important terms that we have to define. U.S. Code defines workers as an employee who is a citizen, a permanent resident, or an individual with legal work authorization in the United States. Importantly, gig workers and independent contractors are often excluded from this definition. This matters because gig workers make up a significant portion of the workforce, about 36% according to the McKinsey study. There's a real kind of nuanced way to interpret US code that functionally defines workers as somebody who is employed for the organization. And independent contractors are not actually defined as employed for the organization, but rather employed for themselves. And so there's no real justification for independent contractors to be included under this resolution. And under that same justification, gig workers are also excluded. And again, this matters because they make up such a massive portion of the workforce. About 36% of the workforce, according to a McKinsey study, are considered gig workers or independent contractors. Their exclusion leaves out millions of workers who are earning less than minimum wage oftentimes and could benefit from a living wage mandate or any type of wage mandate that should apply to them. There are some other nuances in how you can define workers as anybody employed on behalf of you, and that could include independent contractors. But it's really important to note that as it stands, US code does not make an independent contractor a worker for an organization. They are not employed. The employee of the definition is really key in worker, because an employee is different than a worker, or is a subcategory of worker, right? And a worker is an employee, and an employee is not a contractor or a gig worker functionally. So a lot of people could be left out on this topic depending on how you want to define it. You can also define workers in a very broad term to include every person basically who works a job. Next, let's look at living wage, which can also be defined in various ways. From the most basic, which is just covering food, housing, and utilities, to more expansive definitions that include things like healthcare, education, transportation, provisions for unexpected events, uh, and kind of the ability for human thriving. How one defines a living wage can influence a lot of the direction of the debates. Affirmatives are likely going to favor broader interpretations because they'll be arguing conceptions of justice that require wages that allow for more than mere survival. Negatives are going to probably prefer narrower definitions to minimize the resolution's obligations and therefore the scope and effect of the resolution. So now that we kind of have a basic understanding of definitions, let's look at some of the key arguments that we're going to be hearing on this topic. One of the fundamental and philosophical distinctions in the living wage debate is between positive and negative rights. Affirmatives will typically emphasize positive rights, the right to food, housing, healthcare, and a decent standard of living. These rights are often seen as necessary for a meaningful freedom. Philosopher Amartya Sen's capability approach supports this kind of argument by saying that true freedom requires the resource to pursue one's goals, which a living wage could help secure. He doesn't mention specifically within that sentence of the living wage, but his general philosophy talks about freedom requiring the ability to pursue your goal. Without access to basic goods and services, an individual just cannot meaningfully exercise their freedom to improve their well-being. Think about it. If you don't have access to a house, it's going to be really hard for you to exercise a lot of the other freedoms that come along with just basic security and shelter. If you don't have access to food, it's going to be really hard for you to thrive because you'll be constantly starving and working to meet just that basic need. On the other hand, negatives are going to probably rely on the concept that we call negative rights, or the right to be free from interference. Libertarian thinkers like Robert Nozick and Ayn Rand would argue that guaranteeing positive rights necessarily infringes upon others' freedoms. For instance, they claim that forcing businesses to pay higher wages with their property rights and pay higher wages with their property rights influences their freedom to operate. Or governments telling them what specific wages to pay would influence and interfere with their ability to operate their own businesses. Nozick kind of puts a side constraint on rights and suggests that individuals should not be sacrificed really for the greater good. The individual right, rather, should not be sacrificed for the greater good. Thus, a government-imposed living wage under Nozick would probably be viewed as an unjust infringement on business owners' rights to operate freely. Just as business owners don't really like any form of minimum wage increase, and you often see businesses kind of lobby against forms of regulation under this type of thinking. A living wage would just be another form of regulation on businesses from the government telling businesses how to operate. Libertarians really don't like that. There are a lot of critics, though, of that libertarian argument. One of the critics is economist Richard Chappell, who points out that allowing unrestricted economic freedom for the wealthy results in an unequal distribution of power. Just think about wage inequality and the inequality gap that's been growing since the 1970s at an absurd rate, and how power has become more and more isolated within rich, wealthy Americans. A former president is a billionaire. Every person who has been running for president functionally has been millionaires in this country. Most Congress people are millionaires. Wealth is the key to power in this country, it really seems like. And so Chappell's argument would be that unrestricted economic freedom for the wealthy ends up just concentrating the power in the hands of the wealthy and does not allow for anyone else to rise in power. Monopolizing essential resources like drinking water would undermine freedom for everyone else. So why doesn't monopolizing wealth undermine freedom for everyone else? Positive rights frameworks acknowledge that people need access to these basic resources to live freely. And one of those basic resources seems to be income in this country because capitalism demands income for housing, health, food, all of our basic necessities. So, this social responsibility of business argument seems kind of, you know, okay, we're going to put the onus on the business to do it. Well, a lot of the living wage debate also raises questions about how businesses should function. Is it really the government's responsibility to make the business function responsibly? Or should businesses themselves just function responsibly to better their communities and society at large? This idea is called corporate social responsibility, or CSR. And proponents of CSR argue that businesses have moral duties beyond making money. They have duties like ensuring workers earn a living wage, uh, just to make sure that their workers are actually able to live their life. Think of Walmart, where a majority of their workers, even if they're full time, qualify for food stamps. That means that Walmart is not paying their workers enough to shop at Walmart. These kinds of issues are across the board in a lot of different service industry businesses. Many restaurants' prices are way out of the price range for their own staff to eat there at a regular basis. Living wage would work to try to balance this act by saying that we have a duty to make sure, as a business, we have a duty to make sure our workers are earning enough to live their lives. Under this view, businesses are not really beholden to shareholders, but to a much broader much broader set of stakeholders. That includes people like employees and the community in which they operate. By supporting living wages, businesses would be contributing to societal well-being and reducing inequality. And a lot of proponents of corporate social responsibility go beyond just wages, right? We can see the effects of corporate social responsibility when it comes to things like emissions and businesses pushing for decreased emissions beyond standards that are set by the government. Or, there were a lot of large DEI initiatives that were supporting corporate social responsibility. Even though some of those have fallen off, those were under all of those guises that businesses serve more than just a responsibility to their shareholders, but to the community, their employees, and society writ large. There are a lot of critics, though, of corporate social responsibility, or CSR. One of those is the economist Milton Friedman. He famously argued that the responsibility of business is to increase profits. According to Friedman, if businesses divert resources to social causes, like paying a living wage, they are effectively wasting investor money. There are some developments that challenge Friedman's view, but this fiduciary responsibility of the business is kind of been a critical view within the American society for at least 50 years. That all businesses responsibility is for their shareholders and bringing in the most returns possible for their shareholders. Uh, there are, again, people that really think that corporate social responsibility is actually the goal of the business. There has been an increase in shareholder activism that has grown in recent decades, where shareholders have demanded businesses be more responsible towards their workers and society. A lot of this has dealt with the environment. But there has been a growing sense of corporate social responsibility when it comes to paying workers reasonable wages and treating them as human beings and not just, property in which to dispense the best stuff. This trend suggests, though, that businesses can and probably should balance profitability with social responsibility. And there are a lot of actually negative arguments that say that there is a moral reason why businesses should pay a living wage, but not a reason why the government should enforce a living wage. And those are two different kind of arguments. And these distinctions allow business the or negatives to kind of squirrel out of a lot of the arguments that say why a living wage is necessary, but say that the moral responsibility is on businesses to do it and not on the American government to enforce any sort of living wage. And if businesses don't want to pay a living wage, they don't have to, but there is a moral, maybe, duty that they should do it. For affirmative, CSR, though, is a really strategic framing because it argues that businesses ought to prioritize the well-beings of workers, even if it means a slight dip in profits, right? Multi-billion dollar corporations that bring back return after return to shareholders, who's it really hurting in that case if we increase the workers' wages a little bit? There are even some arguments that say that long-term profits will increase because workers will have more income and will be able to afford more goods, which will then increase productivity to match the demand of goods, and that increases the business's well-being in the end. So capitalism, if we actually pay our workers a reasonable living wage, becomes a self-sustaining cycle where businesses will make more profit and then workers can get more money and drive the demand for more goods, which will then increase business profit. And so it is a cycle. And sometimes in the cycle, the business is going to take a hit, but the business will recover and do better at the other end. Negatives might respond, though, that entry-level jobs, especially for young and less educated workers, could be cut back if a living wage is required or implemented, thereby reducing job opportunities. A lot of this would deal with things like AI and automation in the workforce. If you've been to McDonald's in recent years, there's now more ordering on, a touchscreen, and you go to grocery stores and there's self-checkout everywhere. So there is some sense that automation and AI are going to reduce jobs if we force a living wage. But at the other end of it, there have always been forms of automation and AI that have, automation and things that have sped up the work process and decreased the need for workers because it increased worker efficiency. That's not going to end. That's what capitalism does. And so a lot of those arguments are kind of an inevitability. It doesn't really matter about wages. Those things are going to come into place anyway because capitalism drives for efficiency. So let's now turn to kind of the idea of utilitarianism and economic calculation. Utilitarianism is going to be a popular framework on this topic. It just is. It always is. But it's important to distinguish it from the idea of purely economic calculation, because the premise of utilitarianism is to maximize well-being for the greatest number of people, which is not the same as maximizing profits. Affirmatives are going to argue that the well-being of workers ensured through a living wage outweighs any short-term economic drawbacks for a business. Remember that cycle I was talking about. Moreover, many utilitarians, such as those in the effective altruism movement, prioritize reducing suffering and improving the lives of the poor rather than preserving the interests of the wealthy and large corporations. Think about it. If a billionaire with 6 cars and a 10-bedroom house suddenly has to go down to a 4-bedroom or 4 cars and a 6-bedroom house, but by doing so, they let a person living in poverty achieve a normal standard of living in which they no longer need government assistance. Well-being for the overall society is improved. Negatives are going to counter with more economic utilitarian arguments that claim that forcing businesses to pay higher wages are going to lead to job losses and harm economic growth. However, the debate around economic growth needs to consider more than the GDP. Robert Kennedy pointed out in 1968, not the one who was just running for president, his father, in a speech that the gross domestic product measures everything except that which makes life worthwhile. A focus solely on economic figures risks ignoring the human cost of poverty and inequality, which the living wage seeks to address. So when we talk about, economic growth, we're going to have to weigh the effects of slower economic growth towards decreased overall poverty, or potentially decreased poverty against war and other large impacts. The idea that utilitarianism supports policies that benefit the majority while harming a minority is really a misconception, because a living wage debate could hinge on the suffering of a small group of minimum wage workers. Remember when I talked about gig economy workers? They make up 36% of the American workforce. That is not a majority. And yet, a living wage debate, the debate about living wage could have an outsized effect on that 36% of the population if they're included within the living wage. That large impact on that small population could have a much, much higher impact on the overall societal well-being than a marginal impact on the business or the economy. The intensity of the suffering of people in poverty, combined with the potential for alleviation through higher wages, would say that the affirmative should has a link into utilitarianism. Again, affirmatives are going to, though, potentially have to deal with the drawbacks of this program. And of course, negatives are going to try to make them as big as possible. Finally, I just would like to talk about the idea of capitalism in itself. And this part of the argument is actually bidirectional, because there are many people who would say that the living wage is the first step away from the system of capitalism that moves to try to stop the harms of capitalism within our society. And by adopting a living wage, we will move towards a system that benefits social welfare and looks more like a social welfare state in, the Nordic countries, and is ultimately a rejection of capitalism, right? Because if we're saying that businesses can't set wages at whatever they want, and the wage needs to be set at a standard to maintain a basic standard of living, that is a large interference in the state the capital system, and it's a major disruption to how capitalism could potentially work, or should potentially work, according to many economic theorists. On the flip side, though, there are a lot of people that say that a living wage just locks us into a capitalist system. Because if we gear the living wage towards the rate of inflation, functionally what we're going to have is wages will go up, the price of goods will go up. Wages will go up to meet that, the price of goods will go up, and wages will go up. And we'll just continue in the system of capital in which we all work for our basic necessities, and there's no necessarily compassion that exists within the system for, people who can't necessarily work, which, by the way, is another issue within the living wage, is people with disabilities and how they are going to be affected by the living wage. And will basic federal programs for people with disabilities rise? So when we look further afield from just what the responsibility is under the living wage, we begin to see that there are a lot of issues that can come up and can be talked about, including whether or not capitalism is preserved or destroyed through, the living wage, whether or not the living wage can help people with disabilities, whether or not the living wage applies to people with, who work gig jobs and other types of jobs. Ultimately, the living wage debate encapsulates many of the most pressing questions about fairness, rights, and responsibility in our society. Whether through justice frameworks, social responsibility arguments, or utilitarianism, both sides of the resolution make an honestly compelling case. However, the core question remains, should the US require that all workers earn enough to meet their basic needs? Or should wages be left to the discretion of businesses and the free market? By examining these philosophical frameworks, challenging some preconceived notions, we can move beyond snap judgments about poverty and wages to foster a more meaningful conversation about economic justice. This topic challenges us to rethink the structure of our labor system and whether the values we claim to uphold, like fairness, freedom, and opportunity, are reflected in how we treat our workers. The goal is not just to analyze arguments, but begin to imagine solutions that close the growing inequality gap. Good luck, debate hard, and listen to your opponents with a genuine sincerity.